Detective Marple, Mysteries Revealed, Detective Miss Marple's Insight, a Miss Marple Mystery. Pastiche. Welcome dear listener to another tale woven with mystery, thriller and suspense. A story that promises to intrigue and captivate. Shall we begin? Chapter 1. A quiet morning in St. Mary. Miss Marple sat in the parlour, her knitting needles clicking in time with the rhythm of the world outside her window. The garden was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the autumn wind. A few hens pecked around the yard next door, oblivious to the larger rhythms of the world that pulsed beyond St. Mary Mead. The village was always quiet this time of year. The church bells rang out over the green, distant and steady, cutting through the muted buzz of idle gossip that hummed along the lane like clockwork. She'd heard the whispers before. Every village had them. It was just that in St. Mary Mead they could be measured by the tick of the clock, precisely when it suited the villagers to speak, and just as quickly when they'd fall back into their shells. Retreating behind lace curtains and the formality of being proper, Miss Marple's eyes wandered over the landscape. Another quiet morning. Still, there was an expectation hanging in the air, sharp as a knife. Maybe it was the season, with the first brush of cold already in the morning air, or perhaps it was just the feeling that things here didn't stay quiet forever. She'd seen enough to know that much. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. 3 short taps, then the distinct clearing of a throat. She set down her knitting with a sigh and rose to answer. It was Mrs. Constance Blackwell, a woman whose wide, worried eyes usually looked as though they could never be fully at ease. Today they were even more strained than usual, the weight of whatever burden she carried almost visible on her shoulders. "Miss Marple," Constance said, her voice a little too high-pitched, betraying her discomfort. She looked over her shoulder, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as though her feet were on a different mission altogether. "I've come straight from Wyvern House. Something's happened." "Come in, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but steady. She closed the door behind Constance and motioned to a chair by the fire. "What is it?" Constance didn't sit. Instead, she paced a little, the soft rustling of her dress the only sound in the otherwise still room. "I was in the garden." She started wringing her hands, "just doing what I always do, and then I found it, half buried. Like a message from the past. A letter. An old letter, Miss Marple, from 30 years ago at least. It's about the estate, about the inheritance. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, the only sign of intrigue. "And what did this letter say?" Constance turned it over in her mind before answering. "It mentions something about a contested inheritance. A secret, Miss Marple. A secret from the past that could ruin everything." Her voice wavered as though she feared speaking the words aloud might somehow bring the danger closer. "I don't know what to make of it. There's nothing I can do, and it's about the Blackwells, my family. I don't know how to explain it." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her own knee. "No need to rush, my dear. Take your time. I assume you've kept this letter safe?" Constance nodded. "It's in the house, in my desk. I didn't dare move it." She glanced at the door, as if the letter might suddenly sprout legs and walk out if left unattended. "But now I worried. I'm afraid it's too late." "Not too late for what?" Miss Marple asked, though she already knew the answer. The words hung in the air, but Constance didn't say them aloud. The silence said it all. Too late for secrets to remain hidden. Miss Marple sat still for a moment, considering. She didn't say anything. There was no need. Constance was already waiting for the answer she hoped for. Finally, Miss Marple spoke, her voice smooth and unhurried. "It's likely nothing to worry about, Constance. If it's an old family letter, best to keep it safe, as you've said. Let it sit for a while. Perhaps the dust of time has settled over it, and there's nothing to fear. But I'll go by Wyvern House later just to keep an eye on things. I do think that might be for the best." Constance gave a shaky smile. You don't think it's dangerous?" Miss Marple smiled back, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to be understood. Dangerous, dear? Perhaps, or perhaps is just the usual sort of trouble, an inheritance dispute has gone on for too long. The people are always more afraid of secrets than they ought to be. She paused. Then again, there's always the possibility it's not the secret that's dangerous, but what it brings out in people. What's been buried may rise again. Constance's face paled at the words. She bit her lip. Leave it to you, then, she whispered. I don't know what else to do. Miss Marple nodded, the faintest gleam of understanding in her eyes. You've done the right thing. Don't worry, Constance. I'll take care of it. Constance left shortly after, and Miss Marple returned to her seat by the window. The church bells rang again, their sound filled with the same regularity as ever. But something was different now. The air seemed heavier. Something was stirring in the village, and Miss Marple, as ever, was the one to see it first. The peaceful hum of the village life hadn't been disturbed. Yet, her knitting was still sitting on her lap, but now she wasn't as interested in the wall. She'd seen this before. She knew the look of secrets when they were just beginning to show themselves, like tiny cracks in a once pristine facade. The surface was about to break, and when it did, it would spill the old hidden truths, the kind that families kept in the dark corners of their homes. The letter might be nothing, it might be something. Either way, she knew this. Constance Blackwell was scared, and when people were scared, Miss Marple could always find the truth beneath the fear. The clock on the mantel ticked on, and Miss Marple, as always, would wait just long enough. The time for action would come. But not yet. Miss Marple finished her tea and set the cup aside. She reached for her shawl, draped it over her shoulders, and walked to the door. The village, for all its calm, had its restless edges. Something was about to give. She was sure of it. The question then wasn't what would happen, but when, and Miss Marple would be there when it did. Wyvern House wasn't the sort of place that invited spontaneity. The old manor, tucked in behind a thick row of trees, always had the air of something waiting to be uncovered. But today the house felt different. Empty, almost suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The winding gravel driveway leading up to the front door was empty, save for the occasional fallen leaf that caught in the faintest gust of wind. Miss Marple stood at the threshold, her keen eyes scanning the front of the house. The windows, large and proud, offered no glimpse into the world beyond. She had arrived under the guise of neighborly concern, but there was something in the quiet that gnawed at her. It was an unsettling silence, like a room where every detail had been perfectly placed, but none of it seemed real. The part-time housekeeper, a thin woman in her late 40s with the sharp eyes of someone used to seeing too much, led Miss Marple inside. "This way, Miss Marple," she said, her voice carrying just the hint of suspicion, as if Miss Marple wasn't the sort of person to be invited in without good reason. They made their way through the house, past darkened corridors and stately rooms, where the heavy curtains were drawn tight against the morning light. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air. Everything in this house was heavy. Wooden beams, old furniture, antique portraits, all of it steeped in the kind of wealth that only mattered when it was being threatened. When they reached the drawing room, Miss Marple was greeted by a sight she had seen too often, but never quite gotten used to. Sir Roger Blackwell, Constance's distant mask of surprise. He was dead. There was no question about that, but the absence of any sign of a struggle made the scene all the more peculiar. The body had the look of someone who had simply fallen into a deep sleep, only to be woken by something far more final. His hand, still holding the edge of a brandy glass, had slipped as if the weight of his own body had finally become too much to bear. The housekeeper stepped back, as if afraid the air around the body would suddenly crack open. Miss Marple, unfazed, took a long look at the scene, noting the absence of any other signs of intrusion or violence. Her eyes flicked to the hearth. A small piece of scorched paper lay in the ashes, half burned. She moved closer, her hand hovering just above it, careful not to disturb the fragile remains. She recognized the words, inheritance and illegitimate. Just enough to suggest that the letter had meant something. And probably something unpleasant. Poison, I would think, Miss Marple said, not looking up from the letter fragment. The housekeeper nodded, her expression still one of quiet terror. That's what I thought, too. The arrival of Inspector Trevelyan did little to break the stillness that had settled over Wyvern House. He was a tall man built for efficiency, with the heavy presence of someone who had seen enough death to stop being startled by it. But his eyes were sharp, and they swept over the room with the practiced gaze of a man who had spent his life piecing together broken stories. "Looks like poison," Trevelyan said, confirming what Miss Marple had already concluded. "No marks of any kind, not even a struggle." He bent down, inspecting the body, then stood up and surveyed the room again. "Everything looks in place, nothing seems out of order." The local constable, a young man with too much optimism in his eyes, hovered nervously by the door, as though unsure whether he should be involved in the situation or merely an observer. It was clear that he hadn't yet developed the necessary detachment that comes from years of staring at the darker side of life. Trevelyan's eyes settled on Miss Marple. "I take it you've been here long enough to form an opinion, Miss Marple?" "I've been here long enough to know that the devil's always in the details," she replied, "and this one has a few." She nodded toward the half-burned letter still lying on the hearth. Trevelyan stepped closer, raising an eyebrow at the few remaining legible words. "Inheritance, illegitimate. Not much to go on, is there?" Miss Marple gave a thin smile. "No. Not much, but enough to be suspicious. Someone wanted this information gone, or at least partially gone. And if that someone went to the trouble of destroying evidence, I'd wager they didn't do it out of kindness." The inspector nodded grimly. "You're right about that. Still, nothing to connect anyone directly to the deed?" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not yet." Word of the death spread quickly. Though it wasn't the constable's authority that stirred the village, it was the inevitability of the gossip. Within the hour, a few familiar faces gathered at the threshold of Wyvern House, exchanging hushed words that bounced off the brick walls like stones in a pond. Some arrived in carriages, others by foot, but the collective movement was the same, the curiosity that could only exist in a place where everyone's secrets were known by someone else. Miss Marple, standing just to the side, observed the growing crowd, a subtle smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She knew how this would unfold. The villagers would murmur about Sir Roger's wealth, the inheritance, the old family feuds. They would talk about what they knew, real or imagined, and they would each leave with a few more pieces of the puzzle, though none of them would have the full picture. "It was bound to happen," said Mrs. Roberts, the baker's wife, whose deep knowledge of village gossip was rivaled only by her talent for turning anything into a drama. She stood at the gate speaking in a low voice to Mrs. Halstead, the owner of the local inn. "Always knew there was something about him. Too much money, too many questions. A man like that, well, what do you expect?" Mrs. Halstead nodded, though she wasn't fully convinced. "I heard he was looking to change his will just last week." Miss Marple caught the word, her interest piqued, though she kept her expression neutral. Mrs. Halstead's voice was steady, but Miss Marple could see the slight tremor in her hands as she fidgeted with her shawl. A small bit of information, but potentially worth its weight in gold. A will. The truth, Miss Marple knew, wasn't likely to be told to her face, but the layers of suspicion were already starting to pile up, and there was something almost satisfying about the way the village was starting to settle into its natural rhythm again. People talking, stepping over one another, creating their own narratives in the absence of hard facts. It would make things easier when the time came to reveal the truth. She stood quietly, listening to the murmurs, letting the voices of the villagers fill the space. Each word was another clue in a story that had yet to be fully told, and somewhere between the lies and the half-truths, the real reason for Sir Roger's death would be revealed. Miss Marple had a feeling it wouldn't take long. Chapter 2. The cast of suspects emerges. The village of Sunbury Mead had a way of swallowing up the truth, the way an old man might swallow his pride, slowly, reluctantly, and with a hint of desperation. The silence after Sir Roger's death wasn't so much still as it was filled with expectation. Everyone waited for something to give, a crack in the surface that would allow the gossip to rush in like a flood. Miss Marple arrived at Wyvern House the next morning, just as the village's early fog lifted. The manor's dark stone facade loomed over the countryside, its weathered windows like watchful eyes half-lidded. Constance Blackwell, still rattled from the discovery, was in the drawing room, trying to maintain an air of composure that barely held together. The air in the house was thick with the smell of tea, stale, almost like it had been left in the pot too long. Inspector Trevelyan had already arrived and was in the midst of setting things into motion. His uniform was immaculate, his movements precise. He was the kind of man who could keep his emotions in check, the kind who was used to handling the ugly bits of life. And that's what St. Mary Mead needed right now, someone who could handle the ugly bits with cold efficiency. Miss Marple, the inspector said, his eyes flicking over her, I assume you've had your fill of questions already? Miss Marple sat down on one of the chairs near the fireplace, the clicking of her knitting needles a rhythmic sound that seemed out of place against the tense atmosphere. Not yet, Inspector. I've been waiting for you to ask the right ones. Trevelyan's lip twitched. I'm sure you'll be of help. I'm having everyone involved stay close. We can't afford any surprises. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, taking in the cast of characters who had been summoned for questioning. They were all here now, lingering like moths around a dying flame. Some were more obvious than others. They all had secrets. In a village like this, that wasn't exactly unusual, but the way they carried themselves. Suspicious, uneasy. Made it clear that they feared something worse than discovery. They feared being caught. The suspects. Mrs. Constance Blackwell. Constance stood by the window, her hands gripping the edge as though she needed the support to stay upright. She had always had an air of nervousness about her, but now there was something else, the tightness of someone who had seen the inevitable unfold and could do nothing to stop it. I only found the letter yesterday, she said when Trevelyan questioned her, her voice higher than usual, strained. I didn't even know it existed. I was just tending to the garden when I found it, buried under the roses. Her eyes shifted to the door as if afraid someone might overhear. Miss Marple watched her closely. The story didn't sit well. The letter buried in the garden. Too neat, too convenient. There was something off about it. But Constance was already falling back on the routine of a proper lady, distancing herself from whatever it was that had been on her. Mr. Frederick Blackwell, the nephew, tall, with dark, slicked-back hair and a stare that could pin you to the wall. He had arrived unannounced, too sudden for anyone to have prepared. The reason for his visit was as unclear as the reason for his sudden departure. Family matters, he said when questioned, his voice tight, avoiding Trevelyan's eyes. Nothing important. Sir Roger and I didn't exactly see eye to eye on things, but I wasn't the only one who disagreed with him. Frederick's hands were folded behind his back as if he were trying to hide something. His gaze darted to the door every few moments, like a man preparing to make a break for it. He didn't want to be here, that much was clear. The inspector pressed further, asking Frederick where he'd been during the night of the murder, but the response was vague. I was here, around the house, in my room. I don't know, I didn't keep track of time. I didn't hear anything. The lie was thin, stretched too far. Miss Beatrice Soames, Constance's young companion, was an oddity. Timid and skittish, she moved like a shadow, barely making a sound. The soft rustle of her dress, the fidgeting hands, she didn't seem to know where to look, her eyes constantly shifting toward the door or her handbag. Trevelyan's questioning was direct. Where were you when Sir Roger died? He asked. Beatrice flinched, then mumbled something about being in her room, too frightened to do anything. She hadn't heard anything either, of course. Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the repeated glances she cast toward her handbag. It was a small thing, the leather strap, worn, but Beatrice's fingers seemed to linger on it as though there was something inside she didn't want anyone to see. Mr. Miles Havisham. The solicitor, older with glasses perched on his nose and an air of indifference about him that Miss Marple found hard to ignore. He was too calm for someone involved in a murder investigation. He stood by the fire, unmoving, but his eyes were too sharp for comfort. "I was due to meet with Sir Roger the day he died," Havisham explained with an air of disinterest. "We were to discuss some legal matters, nothing pressing, just the usual." He had a way of making everything seem urgent when it wasn't. The inspector leaned in. "And where were you when Sir Roger passed away?" Havisham didn't flinch. "I was in the village, at the inn. I had no reason to be at Wyvern House when Sir Roger was... when he passed." His pause was just long enough to be noticeable. It didn't feel right. There was something about his tone, something that suggested he was hiding more than he let on. But Havisham was a man with money and status, and in a place like St. Mary Mead, that meant his word carried weight. The room was heavy with the weight of secrets. There were cracks in their stories, but Miss Marple knew better than to speak them aloud. Let them think they were being clever. The truth was rarely so simple. She glanced over at Constance, whose muddy gardening gloves still sat in the hallway. A tell, someone who'd been out in the dirt the day before, perhaps in a rush to bury something. Her shoes, still wet with soil, weren't the kind worn by a woman doing casual gardening. Miss Marple had learned long ago to notice the small details that others overlooked. Constance had been closer to the truth than she realized. Then there was the tea in the drawing room, stale as if it had been sitting there for hours. Sir Roger usually drank whiskey, and it was odd that he'd switched to tea on the day of his death. A deliberate switch, or just a convenient one. But it was Beatrice's nervous glances at her handbag that held Miss Marple's attention. The girl was hiding something. What exactly was a mystery? But Miss Marple knew this much: Beatrice wouldn't want anyone digging too deep. And finally, there was Frederick, sweating under pressure, his deflections too quick. He was more involved than he let on, no question about it. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting needles clicking once again, a steady, rhythmic sound in the quiet room. The game was afoot. They all had their stories. But she had the truth. All it needed was the right thread to pull. St. Mary Mead was a village where the world seemed to move just a little slower than it did elsewhere. The wind whispered through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of the bakery, the occasional hiss of the coal cart, and, of course, the gossip. Always the gossip. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, whether they wanted to or not, secrets had a funny way of creeping into the open. They didn't rush, they simply lingered, like a shadow at the edge of a sunny street, just waiting for someone to look away. Miss Marple knew the rhythm of this place as well as she knew her knitting needles. She moved through the village as though she were part of its fabric, a fixture, never attracting too much attention but always absorbing the things people let slip when they thought no one was listening. The post office was a good place to start, and she knew exactly when to make her appearance. The small shop smelled of fresh bread and lavender soap, the kind of scent that hinted at stability, though Miss Marple knew better. The storekeeper, Mrs. Bailey, had the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen it all and kept a mental ledger of what she hadn't. Miss Marple took a seat near the window where the morning sunlight streamed in and ordered her tea with a polite nod. "Business is booming, Mrs. Bailey," Miss Marple commented, setting the scene for what was about to unfold. "I hear Mr. Havisham has been doing well for himself of late." The older woman gave her a sidelong glance before leaning closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Havisham? Doing well?" She paused, a knowing smile forming. "He's in all sorts of trouble, you know. Bad investments, the sort that tie you up in knots unless someone can unravel them for you." Mrs. Bailey's eyes flicked toward the door, as if making sure no one else could hear. Miss Marple hummed a thoughtful note, her fingers tapping the side of her teacup. "Unwise investments. That could certainly explain a sudden need for more funds. And Sir Roger with his vast fortune." Her words hung in the air, unspoken but clearly understood. "Exactly," Mrs. Bailey replied, as if she'd been waiting for someone to say it aloud. "I heard he was after Roger's money, desperate to settle some debts. People say he was at the estate the day before Roger died, trying to get him to sign papers." She lowered her voice further, though Miss Marple didn't need the extra caution. Could have been trying to push Roger into making a new will. Miss Marple let the information settle into the folds of her mind, already piecing together the whispers. A man desperate for cash, an inheritance at stake, an unseemly arrangement, a motive, surely. "And what about Miss Beatrice Solmes?" Miss Marple asked casually, her tone light as she sipped her tea. Mrs. Bailey shifted uncomfortably. "She's more than just a companion, you know. I hear she's got some Blackwell blood in her veins. A distant cousin, though she keeps it quiet. Could be she's got her eye on more than the company." A slow smile tugged at Miss Marple's lips. The seeds of suspicion were beginning to sprout, each piece falling neatly into place. The whispers, the rumors. They painted a picture, though it remained incomplete. She thanked Mrs. Bailey for her time, tucked a few more crumbs of information away, and left the shop, her mind already ticking over the possibilities. The visit to Constance Blackwell was a necessary one, though Miss Marple didn't expect the woman to be any more forthcoming than the gossipers she'd just left behind. Still, there were subtleties to be gathered in the quiet of Wyvern House. In the moments between carefully chosen words, Constance greeted her with a strained smile, but she looked exhausted, as if the weight of the previous day's events had already aged her by years. Miss Marple settled into the same chair she had occupied the day before, the one by the window where the light was just right. She hadn't come for answers, not yet. She had come to listen. "I don't know what to think, Miss Marple," Constance said after the tea had been served, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "Roger and Frederick had an argument the night before, something about property rights, exposure, I think he said. I didn't catch all of it, but they were shouting. Miss Marple's voice was a soft question, as if she were surprised by such a display. Constance lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the recollection. Yes, Frederick was insistent, and Roger was always so calm, you know, but that night he seemed upset. She paused. It was something to do with the estate, the future of the land. Roger wouldn't budge, and Frederick, he didn't take it well. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. Frederick Blackwell had more than just a financial interest in the estate. There was pride at stake, a sense of inheritance that he'd been denied. But that wasn't the whole story, was it? "And Beatrice?" Miss Marple asked, her voice slipping just enough to show a flicker of curiosity. Constance stiffened. "She's been receiving telegrams, mysterious ones. She says they're nothing, just some business matters, but I'm not sure. The way she looks when she reads them, I don't like it, Miss Marple. She's hiding something." Miss Marple nodded as though it were a natural course of events. People hide things, don't they? But sometimes what they're hiding isn't as dangerous as they think. Constance didn't seem to hear her. Her mind was elsewhere, lingering on the image of her cousin's sudden anger. But Miss Marple had already moved on. As Constance talked, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the desk across the room, where the partially burned letter still lay. It had been left in plain sight, as though someone had been too anxious to destroy it properly, as if the need to hide it was greater than the ability to do so. Miss Marple rose from her chair, crossing the room in a few measured steps, her eyes scanning the surface of the desk. A few scattered papers, some ink stains, nothing unusual, until she spotted it. A paragraph, faint but legible. "Illegitimate child." Those words jumped out at her like a whisper from the past. A child who might threaten the Blackwell family line, threaten the inheritance. It was more than a rumor now. It was a fact. Someone had hidden this secret for a reason, and that reason wasn't just to keep a few disgruntled family members at bay. She returned to her seat without a word, the letter tucked in the back of her mind. Constance, still absorbed in her own thoughts, didn't notice the quickness in Miss Marple's movements. But the seeds of suspicion had taken root, and Miss Marple knew the truth was coming. It was just a matter of waiting for the right moment to pull it all together. Miss Marple took her tea in silence, as the village outside whispered its secrets. The pieces were falling into place one by one. The question, as always, wasn't what had happened, but who had the most to lose by it all. And that answer, Miss Marple was certain, would come soon enough. Chapter 3. Hidden Motives. St. Mary Mead was a village made for secrets. Its sprawling estates, the glossy veneer of polite society, all of it crafted to hide what people didn't want seen. Miss Marple had always believed that it was the small moments that revealed more than grand gestures, and today, as the village stretched into the late morning, those small moments were waiting to be discovered. Beatrice Soames was an unlikely suspect. The young companion to Mrs. Constance Blackwell had all the outward signs of someone who would know nothing about a death like Sir Roger's. She was of a different stripe, the kind of girl who had the appearance of being overwhelmed by the world around her, and yet there was something about her that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. She caught the quickness in Beatrice's eyes, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. Miss Marple had no intention of pressing the girl directly. She was too clever for that. Instead, a little chat over the weather. Some idle conversation about the garden. That would be enough. She made her way through the cobbled streets, noting the well-kept facades of the homes she passed. There was a quality to the village today that felt heavier than usual. It was more than just the late autumn fog. It was the oppressive weight of secrets. Beatrice, as expected, was out in the garden, tending to the rose bushes in front of Wyvern House. The flowers looked a little worse for wear, wilting slightly under the pressure of a changing season. Beatrice looked much the same, her appearance neat but strained, as if she too were fighting the onset of something inevitable. "Miss Soames," Miss Marple said brightly, stepping into the garden. "What's a fine morning for gardening?" Beatrice started slightly, as though surprised anyone had noticed her presence. She turned quickly, brushing dirt from her gloves. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said with a forced smile, "I didn't see you there." "Quite all right, my dear," Miss Marple replied. She surveyed the roses, her gaze flicking between them and Beatrice's face. "You must have a good hand with these. They're looking rather well, despite the season." Beatrice flushed, her eyes darting quickly to the flowers, as if she'd rather talk about anything else. "It's nothing, just trying to keep them from getting too much frost." She took a deep breath and then glanced at Miss Marple. "I suppose you've heard the news about Sir Roger?" "I have indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but direct. "A tragedy, wasn't it?" Beatrice's fingers paused for a moment before she pulled at a dead leaf from the stem of a rose. "Yes, it's terrible. I didn't know him very well, you know, only in passing really, but it's hard not to feel the shock of it, leaving here." She swallowed, and Miss Marple saw the fleeting tension in her posture. The girl was hiding something, no question. But Miss Marple didn't let it show on her face. "Did you have much to do with Sir Roger, Miss Soames? You've been at Wyvern House for some time, I gather." Beatrice hesitated. Yes. I've been here a little while now. Mrs. Blackwell, she needed someone to help with her affairs, you know." She fumbled for words, but her hands fidgeted with the gardening gloves, the lie coming out too hastily. "I'm sure you understand, nothing important." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Of course, my dear. And what about these telegrams I hear you've been receiving? Nothing to worry about, I hope?" Beatrice's face paled. "Oh, no, nothing like that. It's just from a relative of mine, a distant aunt. She left me a small inheritance. Nothing worth mentioning, really." "Ah, inheritance," Miss Marple murmured, her tone even. "How interesting. That's a rather common theme, isn't it? Especially in families like the Blackwells." Beatrice stiffened, her fingers twitching as though she were about to reach for her bag, then thought better of it. I really don't know anything about the Blackwells, Miss Marple, just the letters, you know." She quickly turned back to the roses, as though it might shield her from further questioning. Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice low. "I see. It's only natural that one would keep such things private, but sometimes when people are hiding something, it's the smallest things that reveal the truth." Beatrice avoided her gaze, picking at the petals of the nearest flower, though her hand trembled slightly. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Nothing at all," Miss Marple said, her tone sweet but not without edge. "I just find it curious, the way some people She let her words trail off as she turned to leave. "Well, I'm sure it's nothing, but I do wonder about the telegrams." Miss Marple didn't wait for an answer. She could feel Beatrice's eyes on her back as she walked away, and she knew the girl had more to say, but would never say it. Miss Marple had learned long ago to read the spaces between words. The nervous fidgeting, the way Beatrice's voice cracked when she spoke about the telegrams, those were the things that mattered. The girl had lied. Not about the inheritance itself, but about the timing, about the secrecy. It wasn't the telegrams that had her agitated. It was the fact that they had come at a time when Sir Roger had been alive. The pieces were there, scattered, half visible. It was a red herring, but not a useless one. Miss Marple tucked it away like a loose thread, waiting for the time when she would pull it free and unravel the truth. Miss Marple's steps were light but purposeful as she made her way to the small cottage at the far end of St. Mary Mead. The mist hung thick in the air, clinging to the trees and creeping across the narrow roads like a blanket that smothered everything in its path. The village had been quieter than usual after Sir Roger's death, the usual buzz of gossip reduced to a low murmur behind closed doors. But Miss Marple was used to the quiet. It was where people dropped their guard, assuming no one was paying attention. That's when the real truth came out. The day her destination was Mr. Miles Havisham's cottage. It stood at the edge of the village, tucked away behind a row of ancient hedgerows. It was a modest place for a man of his standing. Too modest, perhaps, but then Havisham had always been a practical sort. And practicality, in Miss Marple's experience, often had a lot to do with keeping up appearances while hiding something beneath the surface. Miss Marple knocked lightly on the door, the sharp raps echoing in the empty space between them. A moment later, the door creaked open to reveal Miles Havisham himself, his face drawn tight with the sort of tension that only a man accustomed to secrets could wear well. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice almost too smooth, too rehearsed. "What an unexpected pleasure." The greeting was polite enough, but the way his eyes flicked over her shoulder told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. He hadn't expected her, not really. He hadn't expected anyone to look too closely. "Mr. Havisham," Miss Marple replied in the same measured tone, "I was hoping you might spare a moment for a little chat. I do hate to be a bother, but I'm sure you understand. I've heard so much about the trouble between you and Sir Roger." Havisham stiffened, his eyes sharpening. "Trouble?" he repeated, as though the word left a bad taste in his mouth. There was no trouble, at least nothing more than the usual. Disagreements over business matters, nothing that would have led to... He stopped himself mid-sentence, then cleared his throat. "Nothing that would lead to anything like that." Miss Marple allowed the silence to hang for a moment, then said with a half-smile, "Of course, it's just that from what I hear, Sir Roger owed you quite a sum, isn't that right?" Havisham's gaze faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "Yes. Well, Sir Roger did owe me money. But you must understand, Miss Marple, that doesn't mean I would ever harm him over it." His tone was defensive, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced. She wasn't looking for sincerity, she was looking for the cracks in the facade. "Of course not," she said, her voice light but pointed. "Still, I wonder if that letter has anything to do with it. The one that seems to be causing all sorts of trouble. From what I gather, it could have caused quite a stir, especially considering Sir Roger wasn't exactly the rightful heir to the Blackwell estate, was he?" Havisham's face tightened, the slightest flicker of unease crossing his features before he mastered with a thin smile. "You've been doing your homework, Miss Marple. Yes, the letter was troublesome. It referred to something I didn't know about, something that could have unraveled a great deal of my arrangements." "Arrangements?" Miss Marple pressed. Though she already knew the answer, she could see it in his eyes, the fear of something far more personal than money. "The financial arrangements that I had set up with Sir Roger over the years," Havisham admitted, his voice lowering. "It turns out he wasn't who I thought he was, or who he led me to believe. This letter, it's a mess. It could have undone everything." "And what was in it?" Miss Marple asked gently, leaning forward ever so slightly. Havisham hesitated, his fingers twitching as though he wanted to take a drink but thought better of it. The letter was a threat, a suggestion that Sir Roger's claim to the Blackwell estate wasn't valid, that there was another heir, someone who could come forward and take everything he had worked for. A chill ran through the room, and Miss Marple could feel it. But Havisham seemed to have grown colder still. The realization hit Miss Marple with all its subtlety. The only thing more dangerous than losing money was losing everything. And Sir Roger, with his entitled air and sharp business dealings, had certainly made enemies in places where no one could afford to be made a fool of. "I imagine that was quite troubling," Miss Marple said softly, leaning back. "But no one would go so far as to kill over such a thing, would they?" Havisham's gaze hardened, but the mask cracked for only a moment. "I would never kill a man over money or a letter." He swallowed hard, but his voice was more steady now. "But I did think it was worth mentioning to you, Miss Marple. It's been weighing on my mind." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Of course. Thank you, Mr. Havisham. I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding." She rose to leave, her movements deliberate, each step calculated. "I leave you to your arrangements." As she stepped outside, the weight of the conversation settled around her. Another thread pulled loose, but there were more threads to untangle, more lies to expose. Havisham had confessed just enough, but not too much. He had too many reasons to lie. Money, reputation, and the looming spectre of a new heir. As Miss Marple made her way through the village, the faces of the people she'd spoken to flickered through her mind. Each one had a story to tell, a motive, a fear. Small secrets, perhaps, but secrets all the same. The truth was often in the small things, the half-burned letter, the nervous glances, the hidden silences. Constance, with her too calm demeanor and half-revealed anxieties, had her own reasons to be frightened. Frederick's temper, which he had never quite kept in check, was just as dangerous as any money he might have been hoping to inherit. Beatrice, so full of nervous energy and half-told stories, seemed to know more than she was willing to admit. It was becoming clearer by the day. They all had motives, but not all of them were the same. And there was something deeper running through them, a thread that tied them all together, pulling tighter the more they tried to hide it. Human nature was much the same in a small village as it was everywhere else. People wanted what they couldn't have, and they'd do almost anything to keep others from taking it from them. Miss Marple paused as she reached the village square, the thoughts swirling around her head. She had the pieces now. She knew the story. And she knew one thing for certain. The truth was coming, but it wouldn't come easily. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen over the village that made everything look softer than it should. But even under this warm, almost serene light, there was tension in the air, as though the village, with all its ivy-clad walls and centuries-old secrets, was holding its breath, and Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, was ready to see what would finally slip out. The small study at Wyvern House had been turned into a makeshift command centre, with a stack of papers and a chalkboard set up in the corner, as if this were the sort of thing Inspector Trevelyan had experience with. The sharp-featured inspector was pacing back and forth, a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't used to having his work interrupted by someone who knew too much about human nature, but Miss Marple had made herself indispensable, and so, for the moment, they worked together. "All right, Miss Marple," Trevelyan said, flicking a match and lighting the end of his cigarette. "We need to get the timings right. What I have so far is Frederick's statement. He says he arrived at noon right after lunch and left just shortly after tea. He claims he didn't see Sir Roger before he left, just the usual pleasantries. Constance, according to her, was in the garden the entire afternoon." "And Beatrice?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low, as though unwilling to disturb the silence that had settled between them. "Ah, yes, Miss Soames," Trevelyan said, his tone a bit more clipped. "She said she was out posting a letter just before Sir Roger's body was found. She was seen by the postmaster on her way back. Doesn't match with Frederick's statement, but it's hard to say where the truth ends and the lies begin." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting resting in her lap. She tapped the end of her needle against the edge of her chair thoughtfully. "It's all very tidy, isn't it? Everyone in the right place at the right time, almost too tidy." Trevelyan sighed, rubbing his chin. "It's hard to argue with a solid alibi, Miss Marple, but there's something about these statements that doesn't sit right with me. And you were right about one thing. Small inconsistencies have been cropping up." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Inconsistencies, you say? Which ones?" The inspector paused for a moment, then grabbed a piece of paper and pointed at it. "Frederick. He said he didn't see Sir Roger after lunch. But you recall that Sir Roger and Frederick had a row the night before, correct?" "I do." Miss Marple's lips curled slightly, and what a row it must have been. Sir Roger wasn't the type to quarrel in public, especially not over something so impersonal. But it seems Frederick's temper might have had something to do with it. "Exactly," Trevelyan said, nodding. "Now, Constance's statement, she says she was in the garden all afternoon, supposedly taking care of the roses. But there was no one to confirm that. It's all very convenient. No one saw her, no one heard her, just a woman in the garden, which might be true, but it leaves room for doubt." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And Beatrice? She claims to have been posting a letter, doesn't she? A letter? Perhaps something important." Trevelyan tapped the ash from his cigarette into a small tray, his eyes narrowing in thought. "And that's the real problem, isn't it? The letter. The postmaster swears she was at the counter, but we've got no record of what the letter was, no return address, no forwarding stamp. It's odd, wouldn't you say?" The more they talked, the more it seemed that everyone had a reason to be somewhere else. Constance's absence from the house was too perfect to be trusted. She'd been in the garden all afternoon, as she said, but no one could confirm it. Beatrice's trip to the post office had the same feel, too neat, too tidy. The lie was wrapped in the kind of convenience that made it harder to believe. Frederick's alibi was clear enough on the surface, but the timing of it didn't add up, not when combined with his strained relationship with Sir Roger and the row that had reportedly taken place the night before. "I think we're looking at a series of half-truths," Miss Marple said finally, her voice low and deliberate. "Everyone's story fits together too well. Too much certainty, too much timing. No one likes to admit to uncertainty, and they all have a reason not to admit." Trevelyan leaned back, his hands pressed to the back of the chair. He knew it was coming. He knew that Miss Marple was beginning to see through their carefully constructed alibis. "So, where does that leave us?" Miss Marple tapped her knitting needles together, a faint smile crossing her face. "I don't know yet, Inspector, but I think you're right to start with the small inconsistencies. Those are the cracks in the story." The silence stretched between them as the clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passage of time in a way that felt entirely too deliberate. Trevelyan's eyes shifted to the door, then back to Miss Marple, waiting for her to continue. She had a knack for making the simplest observations feel like revelations, and he knew that this time wouldn't be any different. "We're dealing with a puzzle," Miss Marple said, her voice almost matter-of-fact. "And puzzles, no matter how tightly wrapped they are, always have one piece that doesn't fit." "Frederick, Constance, Beatrice," Trevelyan said, ticking them off on his fingers. Each one had a reason, a possible motive, but what do they stand to gain from Sir Roger's death? "Perhaps that's the wrong question," Miss Marple replied, her gaze steady. "Perhaps the question we should be asking is, who stands to lose the most if the truth about the inheritance comes out?" The pieces were falling into place, slowly but surely. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the more the contradictions took on a clarity of their own. Frederick was a man who stood to lose the most from Sir Roger's death, not just financially, but emotionally as well. There was more to the inheritance than anyone had admitted. Sir Roger wasn't the only one with a stake in it. Constance might have been playing her part, pretending to be a passive bystander, but she wasn't as innocent as she seemed. And Beatrice, with her nervous glances and cryptic letters, was hiding something that went beyond a simple inheritance. But for now, Miss Marple said nothing more. She'd seen enough to know where the trail was headed, but she had learned long ago that some things had to be left unsaid until the time was right to reveal them. For now, the village would keep its secrets a little while longer, but Miss Marple knew the truth was never far behind. She could feel it just beneath the surface, like the faintest tremor before the storm. The village of St. Mary Mead on the surface always seemed like it was just another corner of England's quiet countryside, a place where nothing ever truly changed. But Miss Marple knew better. She'd seen enough in her years to understand that beneath the neat facades of the manor homes and the polite smiles exchanged over morning tea, there was always something lurking, something untold, buried in the shadows, waiting to surface. Miss Marple sat in her small, cozy sitting room, the ticking of the clock punctuating the otherwise still air. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she replayed the scene at Wyvern House in her mind. Sir Roger Blackwell had always been a man of habits. Whiskey was his drink of choice, the sort of habit one could set a clock by. And yet, on the day of his death, it wasn't whiskey that had been found beside him. It had been tea. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she considered the implications. She'd seen the cup with her own eyes, half-finished and sitting by the hearth. The tea, cold now, though still identifiable, was a far cry from the usual glass of whiskey Sir Roger always sipped. Tea, she muttered to herself. She had been over the scene more times than she cared to count, but something had nagged at her. Sir Roger wasn't a man to change his preferences on a whim. No, someone had made the tea for him, and that, Miss Marple suspected, was no accident. The post-mortem report had confirmed what she had already suspected. The cause of death was poison, slow-acting, almost undetectable. The kind that could go unnoticed for hours, creeping into the bloodstream like a snake in the grass. And it had been carefully concealed in the tea. The thing about tea, Miss Marple thought, was that it was far easier to mask the taste of poison in it than in whiskey. Sir Roger, after all, had been used to his drink, so used to it that he'd likely notice if the whiskey tasted off. But tea, served to him by someone else in his home? No, it would have slipped past his defences unnoticed. There it was, the missing link. Whoever made the tea was the key. Miss Marple had just returned from a brisk walk round the village when word came from Wyvern House that Constance had found something. Another piece of the letter, the one that had been burned but not entirely destroyed, had turned up. This time it was not a scrap of burnt paper, but a single charred fragment that could still make out a few words. Constance had brought the letter to Miss Marple's attention immediately, and Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, was unflappable. She inspected the new fragment carefully. The text was still fragmented, the edges singed and frayed, but the meaning was clear enough. The words, "the rightful claim, if proven, shall revert to," hung in the air like a loose thread just out of reach. Miss Marple's fingers brushed against the fragment, her thoughts racing. The phrase spoke of a claim to something, a fortune perhaps. The rightful claim, if proven. It didn't take much to imagine what that meant. Someone, somewhere, had a better right to the Blackwell estate than Sir Roger, and this letter held the key to proving it. She could almost feel the weight of the letter in her hands, as though it had become a time bomb, slowly ticking down to an inevitable explosion. She turned the fragment over, hoping for some kind of additional clue, but found nothing. The rest of the letter was gone, consumed by flames, but the fragments told her everything she needed to know. The letter was the center of this puzzle. Whoever had destroyed it had something to hide. But what? And why? Frederick, Miss Marple murmured, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. The pieces were starting to align, though there were still gaps. Too many gaps. She could feel it in her bones. Sir Roger had not been the only one with a claim to the estate. Someone else had been positioned to inherit it. Someone who, if the letter were ever fully revealed, would lose everything. She took a deep breath and returned the fragment to its envelope. It wasn't enough yet. Not nearly enough. But she knew where the answers lay, and she knew that the truth would reveal itself when the time was right. The more Miss Marple reflected on the case, the more she realized that each person involved seemed to have their own reasons to want Sir Roger gone. Greed, jealousy, fear, all those little human frailties. It wasn't as if she were dealing with a grand conspiracy, a devious plot cooked up by a mastermind. No, it was something more banal, more human than that. Everyone had something to gain from Sir Roger's death, and all of them had secrets they were desperate to keep hidden. Constance, for all her primness, had been tangled up in the mess of the Blackwell estate for years. She had tried to keep it under wraps, kept her distance from the ugly business, but now she was trapped. The letter had threatened to undo everything she had built. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was a direct challenge to her position. Frederick, too, had his own interests. Money, yes, but also pride. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about proving that he was the rightful heir. Sir Roger had always treated him as a lesser cousin, dismissing his claims, making him feel small. The inheritance could be a way of proving everyone wrong. But when the truth of the letter surfaced, it could strip away his claim, leaving him with nothing but his pride to cling to. And Beatrice, poor Beatrice, who seemed so out of place in this world of grand estates and scheming relatives, had more to gain than anyone might have realized. She was more than just a companion. There was more to her background, Miss Marple was sure of it. A distant relative, perhaps, one whose claims might be more legitimate than those of the Blackwells themselves. The village was awash with motives. The letter had shaken the foundation of everything they knew. Everyone had a reason to lie, to cover their tracks. And in a place like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business, it wasn't the truth that mattered. It was the perception of the truth. Miss Marple sat back, watching the sunlight filter through the curtains. The day was slipping by, but there was no rush. She had all the time in the world. The puzzle was close, the solution almost within reach. But it wasn't enough just to know the pieces. She needed to see them together, in their entirety. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was never simple. It was never just about what happened. It was about why it happened, and who had the most to lose. And right now, someone in St. Mary Mead was about to find out that secrets, no matter how well guarded, had a way of slipping through the crack. Chapter 4. Tension Mounts. St. Mary Mead, despite its age-old charm and pristine cottages, had a way of creeping under your skin. It was a village where the walls were thick with gossip, where every turn seemed to reveal more about the people who lived there than they cared to let on. Today, it felt as though the village was holding its breath. Each house, each garden, each passing carriage just waiting for something to break. The village green was quiet in the morning sun, save for the occasional clink of a carriage wheel and the soft patter of boots on cobblestone. It was the sort of morning that might have been peaceful, were it not for the confrontation brewing at the far end of the square. Miss Marple was seated on a nearby bench, her knitting in her lap, her eyes scanning the scene with practiced disinterest. Her fingers moved with the rhythm of habit, but her attention was fixed firmly on the two figures standing under the shade of an old oak tree. Frederick Blackwell stood with his arms crossed, his posture tense, his mouth set in a hard line. Across from him, Miles Havisham, a man who had built his life on contracts and quiet, unseen dealings, shifted from foot to foot, his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Marple's ears caught the raised voices, though she kept her distance, her expression calm and unperturbed. She knew that nothing good ever came from confrontation, but there were times when people revealed their true selves when they thought they had nothing left to hide. "I don't appreciate you meddling in the estate's affairs, Havisham." Frederick snapped, his voice low but insistent. "You've done enough damage already." "Damage?" Havisham's voice was a shade too cool for someone so clearly on edge. "I've done nothing but try to keep things in order, Blackwell. If it weren't for that damned letter, maybe none of this would have happened." Frederick's jaw tightened, the vein in his neck pulsing with the strain of his frustration. "That letter should have stayed buried. You wouldn't have had anything to gain from it being found, would you? If it had been left where it belonged." He cut himself off, his eyes darting nervously toward the people strolling past as though he feared being overheard. Miss Marple kept her eyes trained on Frederick. There was more to his words than he was willing to admit, more to this exchange than the surface anger. She could see it in the way his hands clenched into fists, the way his voice faltered when he spoke of the letter. The man was hiding something, and the fear was evident. "You've no right to speak of things you don't understand." Havisham shot back, a sneer creeping into his tone. "As for that letter, I'm not the one who burned it, am I?" "No," Frederick said quickly, though his eyes were downcast now, unwilling to meet Havisham's gaze. "But you had your hand in it. You had your reasons, too." Miss Marple's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. The truth, it seemed, was catching up with them. The letter had caused enough of a stir that the two men couldn't even speak of it without revealing too much. She listened closely as Frederick muttered under his breath, the words barely audible. "Why would anyone want to kill Roger?" Havisham asked, his tone dripping with accusation. "If you think I had something to do with it, you're wrong. But I suspect it wasn't the money that killed your uncle, Frederick. It was something much darker." Frederick hesitated, a tremor running through him that he couldn't quite hide. "I didn't kill him, but I don't need to explain myself to you." With that, Frederick turned and stormed off, leaving Havisham standing in the middle of the green, fuming quietly. Miss Marple's gaze followed him for a moment before she turned her attention back to the now silent solicitor, who seemed more than willing to stand there and stew in his own thoughts. Miss Marple wasn't surprised by what she'd heard. Frederick had always been quick to anger, quick to blame others. But there was something deeper at play here. It wasn't just money. It was the fear of losing what he thought he was owed. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people, when they were desperate, would do whatever it took to hold on to what they thought was theirs. Frederick's behavior told her everything she needed to know. The trembling hands, the way his voice cracked when he spoke of the letter. There was guilt in that. But guilt alone wasn't enough to convict someone. No, it wasn't just guilt that Miss Marple saw. It was desperation, and desperation, she knew, could drive a person to extremes. As she sat on the bench, letting the sunlight wash over her, Miss Marple's mind worked through the facts. The tea, the letter, the timing. It all added up to one thing, a carefully laid plan that had been put into motion long before Sir Roger had died. She remembered the cup of tea Sir Roger had been drinking when he'd been found dead, the one he had never touched before. Tea, not whiskey, a cup that had been prepared for him by someone else, someone who knew he wouldn't suspect a thing. Miss Marple had spent enough time watching people to know how they hid their intentions. Frederick had wanted Sir Roger's inheritance, and if poisoning him was the way to get it, then perhaps that was what had happened. But Miss Marple wasn't quite ready to make that assumption yet. She'd learned that jumping to conclusions was a fool's game. Instead, she simply watched, listened, and waited. There was more to uncover. She could feel it in the air. Something about Frederick's desperation wasn't the whole story. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple overheard another conversation. This time, a bit of gossip outside the local post office. The voices were quiet, but sharp enough for her to catch snippets of it. "Did you hear about Beatrice?" one of the women said, her voice low but urgent. "She was seen rushing out of the post office the day Roger was found dead. It was strange. She was carrying a telegram, and she looked agitated." Miss Marple's ears perked up at the mention of Beatrice. The girl had always seemed like an enigma, too quiet, too reserved, yet always lingering on the edges of things. And now, this. She'd been in a hurry, had something to hide. Beatrice's reticence, her unwillingness to share anything about her past, her connection to the Blackwell family. Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her involvement than anyone realized. A mention of the telegram, though, caught Miss Marple's attention. What had been in that message? A request for help? A demand? Was it related to the inheritance? She didn't know, but she suspected it wasn't just an innocent piece of correspondence. There was a pattern here, a web of motives tangled together. Beatrice had a role to play in this drama, whether she knew it or not, and Miss Marple wasn't about to let her slip away unnoticed. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, Miss Marple sat on her bench, her knitting abandoned. The village had grown quieter, the whispers now nothing more than the rustle of leaves and the occasional far-off voice. She was used to the stillness. Her mind was full of pieces. Francis's sudden rage, Beatrice's hurried departure, the strange tea in the drawing-room, and Frederick's brittle anger. Something was coming to the surface, and Miss Marple was ready to catch it when it did. The game was still on, but every step forward brought them closer to the truth. The truth was always waiting, she thought, just beneath the surface, patient like a waiting predator, and soon enough it would show itself. But first, the web had to be fully unraveled. Said Mary Mead had a way of drawing people into its quiet rhythms, making even the most curious observers feel like they belonged. The village square, the narrow lanes, the heavy stone facades of the manor houses, there was something about it that felt immutable, like time had decided to stop here, leaving only traces of forgotten dramas buried beneath the surface. Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew better. She'd seen enough of the world to understand that nothing at all was as it appeared, especially not in a place like this. The evening air was cool, just enough to carry the scent of late-blooming flowers and wet earth. Miss Marple walked up the path to the vicarage, her steps quiet but deliberate. It had been a few days since the confrontation at Wyvern House, and while she had gathered pieces, she needed one last thread to pull everything together. The vicarage stood at the edge of the village, a modest house surrounded by neat hedges and a small garden. It looked untouched by time, the stone walls weathered by years of parish life, the windows warm and inviting as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Inside, the vicar himself, a man in his 50s with a thick shock of greying hair, was seated in his study poring over a stack of old hymnals. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" The vicar greeted her, standing to offer a chair. "Good evening, vicar," Miss Marple replied, taking the chair. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," the vicar said, though Miss Marple noticed the slight hesitation in his eyes. There was always something about a quiet man in the village, too much knowledge, too many secrets he wasn't willing to share. "I've been thinking about the Blackwells lately," Miss Marple began, her tone casual as if she were merely commenting on the weather. "All this talk about inheritance and family matters. I wonder if you've heard any old stories about the Blackwells. You know, things from years ago." The vicar's brow furrowed, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shuffled through a few papers on his desk, clearly avoiding her gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, as if to make sure no one else could hear. "There was a scandal many years ago," he said, almost reluctantly. "One of the Blackwells, an illegitimate child born out of wedlock. The family kept it quiet, of course, but the child was said to be someone quite respectable, the sort of person who could have inherited the estate if the birth had been acknowledged. But the family covered it up." Miss Marple's ears perked up. "A scandal? A hidden heir?" She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Who was this child, do you know?" The vicar hesitated, rubbing his chin as if the memory didn't sit well with him. "I'm not sure of the details. I don't think anyone ever knew. It's not something that was discussed openly. There were whispers, of course, but no one ever came forward with the truth." Miss Marple's mind raced as she absorbed the information. A child, hidden away for reasons unknown, likely tied to the Blackwell estate. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Could this be connected to the mysterious letter? Could the child in question have been the one meant to inherit, had the birth been acknowledged? "But do you remember anything else?" Miss Marple pressed. "Any clues? Anything about the child's identity?" The vicar shifted uneasily in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together.